Hello, everybody. Greetings from my very messy office, which needs some compassion every now and then. I'm just flicking through the names, and it's so nice to see so many people, and then also all these new names. I'm delighted. I am very honored that we're going to be. I'm going to get a chance to talk for an hour with a good friend of Narrative Force, a good friend as a colleague and a writer, and just somebody who I've known for a few years, and I've watched as he has sort of grown out into the literary scene and published to great success this fantastic novel that I have a little bit of an investment in because I saw it from the very earliest, well, not the very earliest stages, but fairly early on a few years ago. And it's always a joy to me to see people finding their voice. And of course, we get our voice from the voices of others. And there's so much in this book that I admire the writing, the themes, the characters, the generosity, the style, and of course, the compassion. And today we're going to talk about compassion in writing and compassion in our lives and compassion in action and, all sorts of things, and maybe even some exercises that we'll do. But to be honest with you, Brian has done the lion's share of the work for preparing for this. And I'm going to follow his lead. But I am delighted to introduce him to the Narrative 4 clan. He's been around, as I said, in numerous guises for a number of years, but not all of you have met him yet. So here he is, Mr. Brian Schaefer.
Thank you, Colum. It's really such an honor to be here, and thank you to Narrative for hosting this and inviting me to participate, and also just for all the incredible work that this organization does, which has really inspired me for the years that my husband Stephen and I have been involved, and just in awe watching the work that Colum and Lisa and Felice and everybody that's part of the team does to bring compassionate storytelling into the real world and to have that actually make a difference. And in a lot of ways, it's the thing that attracted me to Narrative 4 was also the seed and the inspiration behind the story that I wanted to tell. And it was very front of mind as I was working on Town and Country, this idea of empathy into action, which, we'll discuss, but that is the ingredients of compassion right there. And it is, it's a process, it's an action, it's a worldview, and it's a constant effort, which Narrative 4 is engaging in the most beautiful, exciting ways. And so to be able to share the story as part of the framework of Narrative 4 is also really exciting and really an honor. And of course, to be in conversation with Colum, who I admired as a writer so much long before we actually met, and then for him to become such a cheerleader, a champion, and now to be in conversation as a colleague is just absolutely thrilling. So thank you again for having me. Thank you all for being here.
My my honor, and thank you for people for coming in all from all over the world.
Yeah, this is thrilling to see all of you for joining us, and I'm excited for this conversation today to look at compassion, what it is, to examine it from different angles, and how we see it in literature, how it has been kind of a foundation of so many of the great stories that that we hold as a society, the way that it has figured into both Colum and Mai's work, him obviously over many books, me in my first effort. And we'll also break down some of the components and some of the tools and techniques of what actually brings compassion into a story. What are some of the limitations and pitfalls and questions that we need to ask ourselves when we approach difficult characters with compassion? And we'll also share some prompts and some action items, ways that we can take these concepts of compassion, bring it into your own writing, if you're also have a writing practice, and also the ways that you can bring it into your lives, so that compassion is something that, drawing the lessons from literature and how we apply it in stories, we can also apply that to our real world relationships.
So, Brian, what is compassion?
What is compassion? I think compassion, as I understand it, as I think about it and apply it, is a capacity to recognize suffering and not just kind of recognize it and identify it, but then actually be moved by it in an emotional sense. And then to take that further, to then be motivated into some sort of action. So, when we think, I think oftentimes compassion and empathy are related to each other. I think they're, siblings and always kind of in conversation. But whereas empathy, I think, is really about identifying and finding that emotional resonance. I think what differentiates compassion is the element of action. And so that it is empathy is kind of, in a sense, a gateway to compassion, but compassion does require a form of action to put it into practice.
I
What
like
do you what
that,
do you
and
think? What's your
that's where
what's your
we're
take?
moving in narrative force in so much is towards this notion of action. I mean, Edward Abbey, the great environmentalist writer, said, sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul. I don't know if I entirely agree with that, because I mean sometimes a story will be enough, or a sentiment will be enough. I personally feel that this is the way we move things slowly, slowly, slowly. But I like the idea of story leads to action, leads to change, and compassion sits on the edge of that ability to change, and it motivates it in that extraordinary way. But in terms of literature, compassion in literature, where
Yeah.
where 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 do you?
Well, I was thinking, I was thinking about some of the kind of classic examples of where we see it. And I think also when we talk about compassion in literature, we're talking in two different ways. We're talking about illustrations of compassion in literature. So the way that we see that play out amongst characters in certain scenarios, in certain stories. And then, of course, compassion can be an effect of literature. So the way that it moves a reader toward an emotional empathy, and then potentially even to some form of action. But in the sense of like these like stories that depict it in really profound ways. I mean, we can go back to the earliest literature, and we can go back to the Bible. And of course, the parable of the Good Samaritan is, probably the epitome of the story of compassion that then leads a foundation for so many stories to come. The idea of recognizing suffering, recognizing someone who is being ignored and passed by in need of help, and taking action to actually alleviate that. And then, if we zoom forward through the history of literature, other examples that came to mind are, for example, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, which, we see the way that a compassionate act changes the life and the trajectory of Jean Valjean, who then, over the course of this epic, also, in the end, performs a compassionate act for his nemesis. And this also becomes such an influential model of the way that we see compassion explored. And then, of course, it brought me a little more contemporary to, a very famous quote about compassion in literature. And, this is from Harper Lee, Atticus Finch, the lawyer to his daughter Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird. And he says, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. And that is very distilled idea of both what compassion is and also what literature can do in the sense of bring us into that point of view, that experience, and to allow us to consider the world from so many different perspectives.
Nice. I
What
like
are
that.
what are some of the books that examples that come to mind for you?
Well, for me, as you were speaking, I was thinking about my experience with Ulysses, which sounds so pretentious and ridiculous, and to immediately go to Ulysses, but it is the greatest novel of the 20th century, and perhaps the greatest novel ever written. But one of the reasons why I want to talk about compassion is that the compassion created in me as a reader and the understanding that was created in me as a reader was extraordinary because Ulysses, as you know, takes place in Dublin, June 16th, 1904. Now, my grandfather, who I met once in my life, was alive on June 16th, 1904. But even more importantly, my great grandfather was alive and close to the age of Leopold Bloom as he walks the streets of Dublin at that particular time. And here I am, I'm reading this invented thing, this novel, this people think that novels are somehow built on lies, but they're not. They're built on the most profound human truths. And so as I'm going through this novel on this journey with Leopold Bloom, who's full of compassion, and Molly Bloom is full of compassion too, but a lot of other things going on at the same time, I began to realize, I was like, holy Jesus, I mean, I am beginning now to understand the life of my great grandfather, whom I never met, and my grandfather, whom I met only one time through this book. And I am actually more deeply engaging with my own life, which is an extraordinary thing. That the blood actually pumping through me at that particular moment was being informed, the history of my blood was being informed by this fiction. And then I began to think, and I still think even to this day, that the very act of storytelling leads to compassion because we move outside of ourselves, because so much of the time we're here, right? And I'm in the arc of what this phone has for me, but then suddenly the world is full of other people. And those other people are the ones who inform us. And of course, Narrative 4 is built on this. But I think the idea of compassion for others is built by the way that we engage with stories and storytelling.
And so for you, when you started telling your own stories, what like how did you choose the characters and the stories that you wanted to explore, and how did you learn to apply compassion toward them?
So I've said it before, but my favorite answer these days is I don't know. Or another answer to this is I have no freaking clue. And honestly, that's the truth. I just like sometimes you just feel it, and this doesn't help students of writing, because they want you sort of, often, and mea culpa, I want formulas. How do you access the characters? I do have some tricks and some things, but I just sort of felt them from the very beginning. I don't know where I learned this. I do think part of it was, a bicycle journey that I took across the United States when I was in my early 20s. But that doesn't account for the idea that I wanted to, dwell and try to understand other people's lives. I wish I knew. But one of the things that I will say is this, that I like the world and I like people. And I don't care who they are or what they are, or how high they happen to be or how low supposedly. I don't even like using that construction, from what sort of different backgrounds. And it's a very elemental truth that every single person in the world is smarter than you, and you've got something to learn from them. Once you like begin to bring that into your life, I think that compassion can build layers and layers and layers. But then we've got to have compassion for, well, we have to have compassion sometimes for things that we don't necessarily like. That's where it gets a little, I think we'll get into that a little bit later as we talk through. You had some other examples from literature as well, right?
Yeah. Well, another one that came to mind was Great Expectations. That's a book that I love that feels the
Charlie Dickens.
trajectory. Yeah, the trajectory of the character, who of so many of the characters, and the way that they write each other off, that people emerge not like you thought they were. It is both an extraordinary display of the author's compassion for these various characters, but also for Pip as he kind of comes to have an understanding. I was flipping through it to see if there was any moments I could point to that like really starkly illustrate this, and it's actually quite explicit in the book. Dickens gives us a very clear. He actually uses the word compassionate at one point as a verb, which I don't think I've seen elsewhere. Correct me if this is this is proper usage, but I absolutely loved it. This idea that that you could verbalize it, and he compassionates, towards Mrs. Hamersham, and like it's a beautiful moment when he returns to her and she's crying. She kind of recognizes what she's done, and she's crying over and over, "What have I done?" And this is a direct quote. He says, "I knew not how to answer or how to comfort her, that she had done a grievous thing in taking an impressionable child to mold into the form that her wild resentment, spurned affection, and wounded pride found vengeance in, I knew full well. But that in shutting out the light of day, she had shut out infinitely more, that in seclusion she had secluded herself from 1,000 natural and healing influences, that her mind, brooding solitary, had grown diseased, I knew equally well. And could I look upon her without compassion, seeing her punishment in the ruin that she was?"
Ooh,
And it's a beautiful description of recognizing the harm that somebody has caused somebody else, and also at the same moment recognizing how that has infected them and
right.
diseased them, and that it's a shame and it's a pity, and to be able to kind of hold both and not to automatically forgive, but to recognize that that a person has done themselves harm by the pain they've inflicted. And it's so in such a kind of a small, tight moment, I find it beautifully expresses what somebody coming to compassion actually looks like in a story.
That's nice. I have a character in a recent novel called Twist, and she says, the disease of our times is that, we don't go, we choose not to go beyond the surface. And I
Mm.
love what you said. In her seclusion, she had secluded herself.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
That in seclusion, she had secluded herself from 1,000 natural and healing influences.
And that brings about a dis-ease.
Mhm.
Right. Okay. And then in your own characters, when you're constructing and well, first of all, like, have you learned a lot? Do we possibly learn the most from our first books? But do you feel that you've learned a lot in the past couple of years?
Yes, I think the question will be as I embark on a second book, how much of that is actually applicable?
Right.
Or you tell me how much of what you learn is really about the, idiosyncratic nature of every particular book, and you kind of learn something new each time. But, and I think the question of perspective and point of view and the different angles at which you look at a story, I think this is going to be a big question for me. With Town and Country, I told the story through six different point of view characters, which was not a conscious decision in the beginning. And for anybody who is also writing, I do not necessarily recommend it. I think any agent or editor would tell you that that is far too many, but it is the way that the story unfolded, in part because I wanted to explore this community from all those different angles. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, and I'll just back up for a second to tell you briefly about Town and Country. It concerns a congressional race in a trendy rural district. It's a fictional town. It takes place roughly contemporary times, but the year is undefined. And it's about how this congressional race upends relationships, and it challenges the loyalties amongst a local family and a group of gay second homeowners. And it puts them in unexpected proximity, unexpected conversation with each other. And by the end, each person has perhaps surprised themselves, has had to reconsider and question their lens on the community, their familial relationships, their romantic relationships, their political identity. And so the race gave me, a lens for which to explore that. But I wanted to look at a lot of different experiences within this world, and so that was the driving force: is how can we approach our political relationships with more empathy and compassion for our neighbors, and how do we actually, pay attention to their experiences
Yeah.
and take that into consideration.
The world is messy, right? And it's in that messiness that we find actually nuance and when we're talking about these diseases, I've talked about the disease of certainty before, like
Mm.
or canals of certainty that get built, and they all go to one particular place. They're man-made things that go, and we all inhabit these canals of certainty, but we don't inhabit the floodplains in between. But the floodplains in between is where the interesting fauna is where the interesting flora is where the interesting, stuff of our minds. But you made some like significant decisions about like not calling people Republicans or Democrats, and you walk a tightrope, and there's a lot of there's a lot of things, and so this in terms of compassion, you we end up having compassion for all sides. I don't like both sides. I like all sides. The
Mm.
idea of all sides. How'd you do that?
That's a good question. I think language was a really important part the of how you both build a character and describe it, but also as an author, the way that you signal to a reader kind of the openness and the generosity that you would like them to extend. And so, for example, the not naming of political parties, there's the language that you use, and also the language that you don't use. It's a naming and also a resistance to naming. And so from the very beginning, I chose not to label people by their political parties. And it wasn't meant to be coy, and it's not a sleight of hand. You'll read the story, and the characters who you think are
Right.
Democrats, and the characters you think are Republicans are Republicans. It's
Yeah.
not, we're not being playful here.
Right.
But what I wanted to do was, words carry such strong associations. We have immediate reactions. We have a reflex to what that is. And sometimes that reflex can be dismissal. And so once somebody falls within a particular category, we kind of reflexively have less interest or bringing a lot of associations to it. And I simply wanted to remove the label, remove that kind of knee-jerk reaction when you see either political party's name, and
Right.
to also free the characters from being defined solely by their
That's
parties.
great. Can I ask you, do you like the characters that you dislike? You understand what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, and
yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
So,
there's a few examples. I'll tell you about one in particular. There's a character named Diane, and she is the wife of one of the congressional candidates. She is a religiously devout real estate agent. She has campaigned in the past against same-sex marriage, and now she finds that her youngest son has come out. And she has also found that she has become the real estate agent of choice for this group of gay second homeowners. And so all of a sudden, this kind of ideological opposition to their relationships and their marriages, at the same time, is now in tension with the fact that they have provided her with a degree of professional pride and success that she never imagined and is quite important to her. And
they're
so
on the
it very
floodplain.
much,
Yeah.
yeah, so it very much challenges it. And that, as you described it, it's that moment of faith and beliefs being challenged and the way that somebody responds to it. This is interesting. And it was important to me that Diane is somebody who is willing to grapple within that tension. I think, particularly for a literary character, somebody who refuses to see or engage the contradictions in their life and who is blind to their, blind to their own blind spots, so to speak, is not very interesting. It's not an interesting place to explore. It doesn't give us the satisfaction of these small steps of growth that I think is what we look for in fiction. Not that everybody is a perfect character, not that everybody comes to the quote unquote right
Right.
decision, but I think it's that struggle and I think it's that effort to take some small step. That is really what I was interested in exploring here. And so, for somebody like Diane to extend that kind of grace to her, to somebody who in real life has fought against my ability to marry my husband,
Right.
at the same time, as a character, I was able to tap into the compassion of trying to understand why she thinks that way, where the obstacles are for her to evolve, and to not ask too much of her, but to allow her the dignity of coming to her faith in good faith and seeing the ways in which she might be willing to change and grow.
That's really interesting. That maybe compassion is about having, like, literary compassion is about having imaginative access to the flaws
Mm.
of our characters in so many ways. I remember this, like, it's a long time ago, but I, probably before you were born. But I wrote a book in the 1990s about homeless people living in the subway tunnels. It's called This Side of Brightness, and it's also about how the tunnels get built. And in that book, I had an interracial couple, and I was talking to my editor, and she was saying that about this Irish girl, that woman character that I created. She said, "Well, she's so nice. I don't like her. She's too nice." And I thought a lot about this, and then I gave her a really significant, a huge flaw, and I agreed. I didn't. She was way too nice. She was just like blah. She was milk toast. Um, and then I gave her a flaw whereby she denies in public. She denies her interracial child.
Mm.
She surprises herself by doing it. She's torn apart by doing it, but she does it. And after that, I loved that character so much, and it was about accessing this horrible moment that actually made her kaleidoscopic, multi-dimensional. As we say, I think we all have those things sort of tucked within us, and if we're going to be really honest, if we're going to be really deeply literary and honest, it will be because we will go to the dark places, because in the dark places, that's where you will find some edge of light.
And to expand on that, in terms of, I mean, and literature has gone to very, very dark places, and some of the characters in literature that have become quite iconic are ones who are horrible people who do horrible things, but the literary treatment of them is so compelling that these stories resonate because of the access they give us to ask these questions, to explore these dark areas. But I'm curious though, the limits of compassion, and what allows a character like Humbert Humbert, to be such a compelling literary character, even as a despicable human, and
This
what
is in
what
Lolita.
allows,
Yeah.
yeah, this is Lolita. So what allows Nabokov to get away with it, so to speak, in terms of the depiction or that exploration, and same with maybe Crime and Punishment in Dostoevsky, where he's exploring somebody, a character who murders someone and then is grappling with the implications and the aftermath of that. What is about that? How do they go right up to the limits and kind of pull off that incredible feat?
There was a famous Irish comedian who at the end of a joke, he'd get a laugh out of some of his jokes, but then he'd stop and he'd just say, "It's the way I tell him," and then he'd get a double laugh. and because I think people, have access. They need that wall broken for a moment. But for me, it's all comes down to language. Everything floats in the language. But language will be nothing if you don't have compassion. Language will be nothing if you don't have anger. All of these love, pride, pity, sacrifice, compassion. These things that actually Faulkner talked about. Faulkner talked about compassion in his 1950 Nobel Literary Prize, Nobel Prize for Literature. He's saying that it's one of the fundamental things about literature, the human heart in conflict with itself. And that's where we found it. Sometimes we're afraid to go there. Like when I was writing This Side of Brightness, I was afraid to go there until somebody opened up my eyes to it. When I wrote a Paragon, for instance, and Rami told me, even though Rami's a real life character and it is a novel, but when Rami told me that he had never seen a Palestinian until the moment he saw this woman, coming down off a bus, clutching the photo of her dead child to her chest. When he was, brave enough to tell me that that was the first time he had actually ever seen someone, and it broke my heart, but it broke him open as a character, and you knew then that there was some fundamental truth going on. He was accessing, this almost like a sort of confessional. Let me tell you, let me walk alongside you, let me be you for a little while. And I thought that was truly amazing.
And so when you put that into literature, when you bring those characters into your story, or, for a story like Let the Great World Spin, which has such a wide, like a vast cast of characters through of so many different experiences, like how do you approach it? What are some of the questions that you ask yourself, or what are some of the research that you do to make sure that you are doing justice to their experience, to their worldview, that you're not falling into traps of tropes and cliches and blind spots? Like, what is the self-examination of making sure that you're doing it appropriately and authentically?
Again, it's a gut feeling. I'm waiting for them to speak honestly. So, for example, in Let the Great World Spin, I did something which in later years became something that literary critics would have balked against. But I was in 2009, and I was allowed to do this, or I allowed myself to do it, and I wrote about a 39-year-old prostitute in the South Bronx, and it's 1974. In 1974, I was in Ireland. I was 9 years old. I had no access to any of this stuff. But I read about the history of prostitution in New York. I looked at photos of Hunts Point. I went out and I met policemen, and I met their families, and I spent time with them, and I got all these stories, and still I had a huge amount of research for about 6 months, and then I tried to write her, and she just wouldn't. Just wasn't there. She was saying things like, "Oh, I was born in Cincinnati," and it's like, "Oh my God!" Like, and then she said to me one day, she said, "The skinniest dog I ever seen was on the side of the Greyhound buses," and I was like, that's it. That's how she talks. And once I got to figure out how she talked, I almost wrote it in that whole section in 2 weeks. But I waited so long to build up, to listen, to how she talked, and to be compassionate with her and alongside her. Again, I go back to the homeless people in the subway tunnels, which was really interesting to me, because I didn't want them to be only homeless. I didn't want to freeze them in their moment of homelessness. We all have stories. And I think the backstory, if we listen, listening is compassion. This engaging. Can you?
So
Can
the
you
re
also? Can you? I do want to get everybody, for you at least, to read a section.
Sure. I think so. This is a section. I'll read this, and this goes to the character who I just introduced, Diane. When the church said being gay was a choice that could be overcome, especially because Pastor George, with such kindness, she accepted it and believed him because she too had made poor choices in her youth and had been invited to make a better one in accepting Christ, who consoled and redeemed her. Others could do the same, especially those engaged in regular unrepentant sin. It wasn't discrimination, she reasoned, merely the protection of a sacred religious right. She had nothing against them other than their ostentatious impiety of their lifestyle. But a few years later, the Presbyterian Church voted to sanction same-sex marriage anyway, and it made Diane dizzy. Hadn't her efforts been a manifestation of the church's teachings? Now those efforts were in opposition to the church's formal position. It was very inconvenient when you thought you were doing God's work, and then God, through the General Assembly, upon a vote of a majority of presbyteries in the United States, changed his mind. At first, she felt betrayed, thrown under the spiritual bus. Then she felt abandoned, left on the side of the road as many in her congregation accepted or even welcomed the new edict and sped past her to a place they called inclusivity. But she'd never intended to be exclusive, only ever consistent in her faith, a defender of the truth as she was told and believed it. So this is me writing as a gay Jewish guy from Los Angeles, trying to enter the mind and the experience of a middle-aged rural Christian woman who truly believes it and is coming to it because this is what she told and she was told and what she accepted and truly believes that she is not intending any disrespect or harm. And so to enter that place and to educate myself about the history of the Presbyterian Church, its evolution, to watch sermons of of various pastors, to understand the language that she spoke, that she would respond to. This was all part of the process of accessing someone who represents political movement that for much of my life I have felt to be in opposition and quite dismissive of my love and my relationships. But in entering this character and understanding kind of how she got to where she is now, I did develop a lot of compassion for her and also appreciation for the effort that she does make ultimately in this book to take a step towards her son, to open herself up in a small way. And it kind of illustrated for me the grace that we extend to others, I think, is part of that seed of giving them permission to extend grace themselves.
That's so beautifully put. Wow, thank you.
I think we're getting to the point where we're going to invite questions from everybody. But I also wanted to spend a moment to continue in that thread a little bit and this idea of taking the compassion that we see and practice in literature and how we might apply that to our lives. Like, is there ways in which the practice of your writing is something that obviously was one of the seeds of Narrative 4,
Right.
which is, building that bridge between the storytelling that we're talking about in literature and actually bringing it into the real world. And if you want to talk about a little bit about how your fiction actually led to what Narrative 4 is doing.
Yeah, I mean, I feel more and more and more that that my books are becoming narrative for books. I have this life now where yeah, I'm an author, but a good deal of my time is spent working with the folks in Narrative 4 and going to places and fundraising, and I love it. It's something that bolsters my life. I feel blessed by it. There's a tension sometimes between these two things, and yet there's not as well, because I think these two things work in tandem with one another. I think I wrote a Narrative 4 book when I wrote A Paragon, which is about an Israeli and a Palestinian, as you know. And I think that's my ultimate Narrative 4 book, but others are there too. And I was going to just read a very quick section from a book called Let the Great World Spin. And I just decided to do this right now because it's based on what you read about Diane. And it's kind of similar. This is just like a 2-minute thing about Corrigan, who's an Irish monk who lives in the Bronx. And he's trying to figure out his relationship with God, and he's in trouble. He's in trouble with it. So his brother actually narrates it. He said, Corrigan told me once that Christ was quite easy to understand. He went where he was supposed to go. He stayed where he was needed. He took little or nothing along, a pair of sandals, a bit of a shirt, a few odds and ends to stave off the loneliness. He never rejected the world. If he had rejected it, he would have been rejecting mystery. And if he had rejected mystery, he would have been rejecting faith. What Corrigan wanted was a fully believable God, one you could find in the grime of the everyday. The comfort he got from the hard, cold truth, the filth, the war, the poverty, was that life could be capable of small beauties. He wasn't interested in the glorious tales of the afterlife or the notions of a honey-soaked heaven. To him, that was a dressing room for hell. Rather, he consoled himself with the fact that in the real world, when he looked closely into the darkness, he might find the presence of a light, damaged and bruised, but a little light all the same. He wanted, quite simply, for the world to be a better place, and he was in the habit of hoping for it. Out of that came some sort of triumph that went beyond theological proof, a cause for optimism against all the evidence. Someday, he said, the meek might actually want it. And I suppose, in many ways, that's my definition of compassion, which I find hard to put a formal definition around, but I can definitely put a character in that place so that we feel that tension that's going on between all these characters. And this is the job of the artist. This is what you did so well in Town and Country too, because you captured all those tensions and you allowed them to live on the same plane. And it seems to me that that's where art has its and art and storytelling has its function for us nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautifully said. We'd love to answer people's questions. Please feel free to put them in the chat and we will take them as they come. And we also, and as you're doing that, we also have some prompts, some writing prompts and some, calls to action related to some of the things that we've been talking about. So that will give opportunities to explore ideas of compassion in your own writing, and also to identify the ways that it appears in other art that you consume, in ways that you can bring it into your own life.
I love those prompts that you have, like on a technical level. Sometimes people want like tiny little things to come along. Like if you're writing a character and you don't get them, right, and they're just frustrating the hell out of you. Sometimes you're writing from third person. One of the simple things to do, and to really muck things up a little bit and scuff them up a bit, is to start writing them in the first person. And then you realize, oh wow, that's something. And then sometimes you put them in or you start in the first person, and then you start looking at the third person, and all these different kaleidoscopic angles, which is what Town and Country does. It goes at all these different angles to the quote unquote truth, because there's so much more than one truth. All these angles will help you, as a writer, to reimagine your story and reimagine your characters.
That's great because you just answered Christine's question, which is about first person point of view and third person
Really?
person close,
I don't have
and
access to the chat. Oh, let me see. I can get it here.
yeah. And so, for those, you're probably mostly familiar, but first person is when a character speaks in I, and you are hearing their voice and I did this, I thought this. And a third person would be he did this, she said that. And then a close third person would be using the he said, she thought, etc., but doing it in a way that we are really, really inside their brain. And so we do know exactly what they're thinking. Barbara has a question, which I think should be the first one that we answer, which is what exactly is narrative 4? And so if you've come to this conversation and you're not familiar with narrative 4, then Colum, please give us a little bit of an introduction.
Narrative 4 is the greatest organization in the world.
Yes.
Narrative 4 brings people together through the power of storytelling to allow change and compassion within their communities. So we use storytelling. Brian would tell my story and I would tell his to lead us towards an understanding that creates action. We're in dozens of countries around the world. We're all over the United States. Teachers are my heroes. There's loads of teachers, including Lillian De Jesus, who I want to give a special shout out to today. There's loads of teachers on the chat today. Go to narrative4.com, see what it is that we do, join us. We do facilitator training, and we allow people to come together through the power of storytelling.
Beautifully said. And, and at the heart of it is this concept of the story exchange, which is, as you described, it's when you sit with somebody, you listen to their story, and then you essentially absorb it and tell it back as if it were your own. And in a lot of ways, this is what we do with fiction. We listen, we absorb, and then we tell it back in a way that gives dignity to the person whose experience it is. And the story exchange is a beautifully simple but very profound kind of seed for all these broader conversations that are putting people in intimate conversation who otherwise don't often have the opportunity to listen and learn and share. Aaron is asking, I think this is like a really beautiful question: is there hopefulness built into compassion? Is it inherently an optimistic quality, do you think?
Ah, that's a great question. I think there's a tension between, having to have compassion because if you have to have compassion, something might have occurred for which you have to have, a sort of an element of forgiveness.
So John is asking if we can explore more how we can write in a compassionate way about a character that we have no experience with. And this is one of the big questions of fiction is also who is, quote unquote allowed to write certain characters, certain voices. We want to see a broad world depicted in our fiction and in our stories. And at the same time, we have to do it responsibly.
Right.
And part of that is the research that we talked about. In terms of how we write about it compassionately, as I mentioned earlier, I think language and tone are important kind of tools and techniques to pay attention to. One example that I have in my novel is this kind of group of second homeowners who kind of descend on this rural town and are a bit oblivious to some of the issues that their neighbors are facing. And I wanted to find a term to kind of describe them the way that the locals would. Now, my husband and I split our time with the Hudson Valley, and so this is a dynamic that I've been observing for over a decade. It was part of the inspiration for Town and Country. And what we are actually called, those of us who kind of split our time between the city and upstate, we are called Cityots, which is a fantastic name. And it's really amusing, but is also it has a bite to it, and it is quite dismissive. And the way that I wanted to tell the story is with more generosity, as Colum said, to all sides. And so I wanted to find a different term. And so I came up with the term duffel, which is, the little bag that people carry when they come for the weekend and they get off the train and they only need a little duffel bag because they're only staying for a couple days and then they're going right back home. So it was a more descriptive term. And in that way, it kind of helped me in terms of my approach make sure that I was approaching all of these characters with the same sense of respect for where they're coming from and what their experiences are. That I wasn't dismissing them or one half of them in applying this kind of harsh term "idiot" to them. And so, in the way that we describe things, the actual words that we choose in our descriptions, this is a huge part of kind of finding and sharing the compassion. Sometimes a character, the correct choice for a character is that they are going to be harsh and judgmental and dismissive, but it is a choice, and you, as a writer, are choosing the language that you use that is the right choice for that particular character in the role that they play, but also for you as an author in the way that you want the reader to receive the characters that you're offering. And another example is just kind of the general tone. When I first started writing Town and Country, I actually started it as a satire, and I thought that I would satirize this kind of oblivious group of second homeowners. But as I went from draft to draft and it evolved, I realized that that is not what I wanted to offer. That's not the way that I wanted to kind of explore these dynamics. And so it became, so the tone that I employed became a lot more sincere, that manifest in the way that each of the characters make the choices that they make. And so that the tone with which you approach a project is also a big part of how you can illustrate and demonstrate your compassion.
Great. I just want to say, in relation to that, the people who talk about cultural appropriation and have been talking about it for the last few years, they are entirely correct. They are entirely correct. There has been appropriation. There have been people gone in and they have plundered and they've stereotyped and they've done all these things. And yet there's another way to go about it too. And that's by going in with your head bowed, saying, I don't know, I want to know, I would like to know, and with as much humility as you can possibly can and as much honesty as you possibly can, to go back to your own culture and increase the lung space of your own culture by engaging with another.
I think we have time for one more question, and I want to end with Marnie's because I think it's a really a great one that that I think we can all that is a great question for all of us to kind of leave with and to reflect on. Are you able to extend the same compassion to yourselves as writers as you extend to your characters?
Okay, Marnie, I'm going to leave the last word for Brian because, like, sometimes I really really dislike myself, and I'm in the midst of a novel, and I'm like, you lost it, you don't have it anymore, you won't have it anymore, you're fooling people, you're a charlatan, you're a chameleon, and it ain't gonna work anymore. And you then have to have compassion for yourself because it's all about this process of failing. And my favorite quote, as many people have heard ad nauseum, is no matter, try again, fail better. And so it's a great question, and yes, you do have to have compassion for yourself. Brian.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the way that we do is again the language that we apply to ourselves, and it's like it's the names that we call ourselves. It's what we call when we fail. Like, how do I speak to myself when I make a mistake, or I fail at a task, or I fail in a role, or I do something that I regret? And with my example that I just gave about Sidiots versus Duffels, can I find language that is less judgmental for myself, that doesn't, apply a label to me when I failed in a particular way? And then I think the other way that I kind of use the tools of fiction to apply to myself are to kind of ask the question of like, well, like have I tried to understand? Have I taken this quote unquote failure and am I finding a way to grow from it and within it? And that's the thing that I always ask of my characters as well. So, a complex character is going to have negative traits and positive traits. But I think one of the things that we're interested in and why we want to follow them as characters is if we see that attempt and we see that like that small step towards a form of growth. And so I think when I am in a similar situation of feeling like a complete failure, I try to apply that same thing and find the little steps that I can take to grow.
That's beautiful. And can I just say, I'm like just flicking through the questions. There's so many questions, and I'm grateful to have had this chance to be here with you, Brian. And I'm grateful to everyone at Narrative Four for setting all this up. But most of all, I'm really grateful for all those people who, who've been listening to us. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question, I hope at some stage we will answer your question, or you'll find the answer to the question yourselves. But it's just brilliant, and I love being part of this. So thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you, Colin. This has been such a joy, such a pleasure. Thank you all for joining us today. It's been really wonderful and special to have you all here. Thank you for your questions. I can't see if we got our prompts and calls to action into the chat, but I think we'll be able to share them with you in a follow-up as well. So we'll certainly be sure to do that. And again, thank you, Colin, for this wonderful conversation, for your work in your
Thank you.
writing and with Narrative 4. Thank you to Felice and Amanda for helping to organize this technically and for supporting it and for making this happen.
Thank you,
We really
Lisa.
appreciate it. And thank you, Lisa, so much for Lisa, the Colin's co-founder with Narrative 4. It's really such an honor and a joy to be part of this organization and to share this conversation today.
Brilliant. You're absolutely brilliant. Thank you.